My friends, good day. I like Volkswagen. There is nothing new for you, I think. And the most standard comment for my channel is that it's lame shit, because it falls apart, because it's complicated, because any parts are costly, my Lada is a different story, you could change the whole car for pocket money. And yes, those are serious arguments you could easily criticize my favorite brand with. But what if I could tell you that there are darker spots in Volkswagen's history? What if I could tell you that this brand, this company, began with a great and full-fledged deception of the German nation? What if I could tell you that lies and larceny followed that company since the first day of its existence? And what if I could tell you that the Volkswagen brand was indirectly connected with thousands and thousands of deaths? And also, today you will find out how it could be that the most successful and huge concern of our time could have been British. And when does Ford come in? Autopragmat – selection of used cars. Welcome to the new format on my channel where I would research the most interesting and contradictory moments in the history of car companies. And don't think that I try to justify them, because I decided to make the first episode about my favorite concern, Volkswagen. I would like to show you today the moments of history of that brand that Volkswagen itself isn't very fond of. And because it's a new format, it depends on your support very much. That's why if you would like this video, if you would find it interesting, you should show some activity. Leave a like, write some comments, and the very best thing would be sharing it through your media. Show it to your friends, look what an interesting thing Stas has made. And if I could raise some suspense, you could get yourselves a cup of tea or make some sandwich, get yourselves comfortable, because we'll have a long and through but interesting conversation. We should begin it with this guy, Henry Ford. Don't get surprised, we'll get to Volkswagen, but you just have to know some historical context to realize what's going on. Ford was a brilliant inventor, industrialist, business magnate, and so on and so forth. I have this book standing on my bookshelf. I recommend it if you get through it because it's a big draggy. First off, Ford became famous because he put the car assembly into production line. Everyone says that Ford invented the method of line assembly as it is, but that's not right. The assembly line existed before Ford, but he deserved his credit for putting into line that sophisticated production that needed to be maintained after that, the car. Well, the end product consisted from a lot of parts, and in the operating process, you have to take them off, change them, tend them, and so on. And before Ford, no one has done such a thing. And the main product of his genius was Ford Model T, the so-called first people's car. And being on the assembly line for a long time, that Ford could be assembled after 14 hours. 14 hours from a bunch of bolts and nuts to a car. We could waste half a year for ground effects, and here's a car in 14 hours. Considering the technical equipment of 1908, when a straight wrench alone was some kind of nanotechnology. And in the end, the car was very cheap. At the time of its launch, it cost $800, and while the average cost of a car of that time was $1,300 or $1,500, that was pretty cheap. And later, after 8 years of the assembly line, it cost $350. Because the assembly line model plays off in time, everything gets cheaper and blah blah blah. Long story short, it was the first cheap people's vehicle. And during those 8 years, they sold 750,000 cars. Just so you know, Oldsmobile Curved Dash was also quite a popular car at that time, and during 6 years on the assembly line, they sold 19,000 of those cars. 750,000 for 8 years and 19 for 6. That represents Ford's brilliance, and that of Ford Model T. It wasn't enough that Ford was a brilliant industrialist, inventor, and so on. He was a prominent politician. He was writing down his thoughts, publishing books, he had his own newspaper, and they were publishing their production. One of those works was The International Jew. The book about international hybridum. That book was actually built upon Secret This Age of Zion, and that document was a conspiracy theory that described plans of the Jews to enslave the whole world, to dominate globally, to enslave the Christians, and so on and so forth. Just in case, I still remember that we're talking about cars. Have patience, we're gonna get back there. So, that document, The Stage of Zion, was just a fake, but that didn't prevent all the anti-Semites of the world to actually believe it and to shout on every corner that Jews were evil. And Ford was one of those guys. He also believed firmly in all of that, and he even founded a detective agency that spied secretly on all the famous Jews and on those people who could be Jews, if anything. But all this anti-Semitic activity of Ford ended when he couldn't prove this theory to anyone. He paid huge fines and legal fees for lawsuits against him, and actually very many people sued him because of such nonsense. And in 1927, he publicly renounced all of his views, apologized, and promised to withdraw all his literature and his works he wrote against Jews. But there was another person in the world who dreamt to create a people's car the same way, and hated Jews even more. Adolf Hitler. Ford was his idol. In Hitler's office, there was a huge Ford's portrait hanging. In all of his interviews and in his book Mein Kampf, he used extracts from Ford's works. The book The International Jew was translated into German literally after it was published, and it was actively propagandized for German young people who also held Ford as an idol. Here I have to make a quotation. In the interview to the Chicago Tribune on the 8th March 1923, Hitler said, "We consider Henry Ford as the leader of the growing fascism movement in America. We admire particularly his anti-Jewish policy. It concurs with the platform of Bavarian fascists." And at that point, focus owners are like, what's happening? Like, what? And naturally, because Hitler just worshipped Ford, he wanted to repeat his achievement and to create a people's vehicle, but for the German nation. I must say that a politician that could seriously gain people's trust and could promise to his nation that people would get their personal cars, that politician could gain really huge political assets. In 1920s, 1930s, a personal car was just an impossible dream. That was a really clever move to gain control over the population. The car development went to that guy, Ferdinand Porsche. The task was following. They needed to create a car that could easily go with 90 kilometers per hour, that could contain 5 people, 2 grown-ups and 3 children, a typical German family at that point, and it had to cost 990 Reichsmarks, about $400 at that point. And you should understand the key difference of the Beetle from the Model T. The Model T was a business product, and the Beetle was a social project. And here we are. In general, the technological components, the design of the engine, the steering response, and so on, that was not important. Because that was just a social project. That was a social and political idea, not a vehicle. And actually, no one was going to produce it at all. But I will tell about it later. And now let's go back to Porsche. Porsche was lacking the most important resource, the time for development. To create a cheap car is way more difficult than an expensive one, because you have to develop the design that would be viable, but also simple, reliable, maintainable, and also with minimal amount of parts. You have to put it on the assembly line, and all of that had to be worth it to be called the dream of the German nation, and to cost $400. Although no one asked Ferdinand for his car to be a perfect technical genius, Porsche never made anything mediocre. The car that he designed was really brilliant. It was being produced from 1938 till 2003. Well, 2003! The whole amount was 21.5 million of cars. It had a 1-liter flat engine in the back. The rear engine composition, well, that was a real Porsche. Its steering possibility was just crazy for its class. And that was the first vehicle of such a serial scale that used the word aerodynamics. That was the first aerodynamics vehicle, and also that was particularly impossible to break it. That's why it found the market up until 2003. It was being complied in Mexico. There are Beetles in Mexico that were produced in 2003 and invented in the 30s. And essentially, that car ushered in an era of real German cars that, by their technologies, reliability, and looks, were unachievable for all the rest car concerns in the world. And at that point, all the fans of Volkswagen could stand up and clap. Well, Porsche was a genius. He created the most popular and technological vehicle of all the time, and the most recognizable one. They could poke the Toyota Club, watch and learn all of that. But Porsche stole the Beetle. Well, not in fully, naturally, but in parts. In 1931, Porsche presented his prototype, the Porsche Type 12, and by 1932, there were the first pre-production samples. By the way, James May drew one of those in his documentary dedicated to people's vehicles. And if you didn't see the documentary, watch it, it's very interesting. But for some reason, he didn't tell that a year before the first Porsche prototypes appeared, Hans Litvinka in Czechoslovakia created the prototype of Tatra V570 that later turned to the post-war car Tatra Type 97. Hans Litvinka was an Austrian vehicle designer that was the head of the design studio of the Czechoslovakian company Tatra that produced vehicles. And you could be like, Tatra? Porsche? Are you completely high or something? And I tell yes, I'm not high, but Porsche actually stole the idea and design from Tatra. At that time, Porsche traveled a lot, watching car factories. He even visited the Soviet tank and aircraft factories. By the way, they tried to lure him to us so that he could organize our production, but they didn't agree on something. And Porsche pretty often visited Tatra factories in Czechoslovakia, and I must say that prototype Tatra V570 was the first car in history that was created with the hint of aerodynamics. Not the Beetle, as many people think, but Tatra. Its design was totally, completely batshit crazy at that time. Of course, when the Beetle was being prepared to launch in 1937, Tatra directly sued Porsche and Volkswagen and the whole Germany, just like Porsche stole 10 patents from them. And Porsche didn't even resist very much. He just said, well, yes, guys, I stole a bit from Litvinka. What's the big deal? Well, it happens to everyone, but Hitler interfered. What a shoot! Conquer them! And in 1938, in a year, Czechoslovakia was conquered. Yeah, guys, okay, the problem is solved. But then, in post-war years, in 1967, when Porsche was already dead, Volkswagen had to pay 3 million marks as compensation because they really stole 10 patents from Tatra. But after the war, Volkswagen had to pay retributions not only to Czechoslovakia, but also to ordinary, simple German people. Why, you ask? You would ask. You would definitely ask. And I will answer. Actually, originally, the car was called the KDF wagon. Well, Käfer, Beetle, or Volkswagen Type 1, that was already in post-war years, and originally that car was called KDF wagon. KDF stands for the stuff. I don't know how to read German, but it translates as a power through joy. Actually, that was the ministry that answered for leisure of the population and creation of the ideal way of life of the German nation. They organized different events, concerts, they built vacation retreats, huge cruise liners, parks to be improved each 10 years, and so on. And they were responsible for that project, KDF wagon. That was just a little brick or one of the elements of the ideal life of a Nazi family. In promotional videos and propaganda, there were careless vacations where a German family could get into their KDF wagon and go driving to their KDF resort to enjoy their KDF liner. And the guys had a whole fleet of those ships, and their flagman was that bucket. That 10-decked liner was one of the largest passenger ships at the moment it was built, and during weekdays, families and other population could enjoy countless events organized by KDF. Of course, they needed money, and they gathered money from people. And although the personal car was an impossible dream, ideal, and so on and so forth, it wasn't a mandatory attribute. Because of that, in order to sell it to people, KDF spread a huge, just giant advertising campaign. Promotional materials were being produced by the ton. Marriage in modern language. They produced board games, different toys, posters, cards. As soon as the first pre-production samples appeared, they were given to the political elite, and they drew them on all parades and common arrangements. And even Hitler in his speeches constantly reminded to people that very soon, very quickly, right now, you would get your own personal family car. The last watertight argument was the buying system. As I said before, the task was to fit the car for 990 Reichsmarks, and the average salary of a family in a month was 120 marks. And when the car was being designed, there wasn't even a factory. It had to be built in, theoretically. And the government suggested the option. All who wanted to purchase a car got such Sparkarten, saving books, under a slogan that you should lay aside 5 marks a week to get your personal car. Each week, people had to buy special marks for 5 Reichsmarks and to glue them into that saving book. And week after week, and they gathered a whole sum like that. And if you missed just one payment, all the previous ones just died. And when a person gathered 990 Reichsmarks on his account, they had the right to apply for a car and they had to give it to them. 5 marks a week for your personal car was just a completely amazing offer for families and a super stable way to restock the treasury for the state. And of course, as soon as they announced it to people, those simple working families just rushed to give their money for those Sparkarten and marks. Approximately about 350,000 German families played that game when the project started. Of course, they began to build the Volkswagen factory at once. One of the first ones that exists up till now, by the way. And in 1938, that factory was opened. By that opening, people have been giving their money to the state even more urgently to get their precious KDF wagon. But that didn't happen. No one ever got even one vehicle. No one at all. They just created only several pre-production samples that were shown to the public on parades, like very quickly, very soon, you would have your car. But Hitler needed all the money, including the Volkswagen factory, not for that, but war. The giant factory was the giant junction of Hitler's war machine. All the design of the Beetle, his platform, if you want, was adapted to producing war cars that were called Kübelwagen on its base, or Volkswagen Type 82. And before becoming the main production car in the history of people, the Beetle was the most production war vehicle of the Nazi Germany. The Kübelwagen had about 30 modifications. It had an open and enclosed body, HQ modificators, and even amphibian. It wasn't enough that instead of that peaceful, pretty and cute little car, Volkswagen Beetle, that factory produced military cars, it was the place war prisoners were working at. And the slaves, essentially, they were building the main Hitler's weapon, the V1 missiles. The name stood for the retaliation weapon. The main feature was its remote control. It was practically impossible to find out the place the missile flew out of, and the most important thing, where the missile would land. That weapon could seriously turn the tide of war, really, but the Allies didn't waste their time and found out quickly where those missiles were being produced, and they bombed the factory. Only London took a great hit, because it wasn't far away. About 2,500 of those missiles hit the London, and about 10,000 of them flew towards England. We'll know the result of the World War II. In the end, the Volkswagen factory lied in ruins. The production of the Beetle, or any people's vehicle, or global vehicle, was out of the question. The remains of the factory went to the British, and honestly, they had no idea what to do with them. But during some magical course of events, that factory that was lying in ruins had some blueprints and some prototypes. A bit distorted, but they were still alive, and the British found them. After that, they decided to fix them somehow and to show them to the British military. The military appreciated the design because Porsche had initially put reliability and maintainability in that car, and that was sought up in the army. The first order that the Volkswagen factory received was from the British Army. They had to produce 20,000 Beetles, and the titanically difficult reconstruction of the factory began. By 1947 already it began to get a bit of orders from other countries, and in that moment the British and the Americans made just the dumbest, the most stupid mistake in the history of car making. When the factory was put back on its feet, even if those feet were crooked, but still it was made and some production began, they tried so hard to offer that factory to everyone as some military reparation, like, take it, we don't need that. Perhaps you could take it as our debt, please. And both American and British car-making companies, all of them said that it was some shit and they didn't need it. Ford, the owner of the Ford company, and its director said that the whole factory wasn't worth a jigger. And the whole factory that wasn't worth a jigger, all that concern is now the biggest and the most profitable on earth. In 2018, the annual turnover of Volkswagen was 260 billion, and that great, magnificent and all-powerful Ford, 170. And if Ford's chiefs weren't so dumb, all of that could be one concern now. And we could witness a very funny story because initially the factory that inspired Hitler to create a people's vehicle would own the results of his activity. But you see, history knows no if, and in the year 1949, as no one didn't give a shit about that factory, the British decided to give it back to Germany. At that point, already for 1.5 years, Henrik Nordhoff was the head of the company. That man and his team raised the factory from the ruins. Already in 1961, that factory produced its 1 millionth car. And in 1972, 27 years after the World War II, the Volkswagen Beetle's production would surpass the Ford Model T, and the Volkswagen Beetle became the most saleable and successful vehicle of that time. And now the Corolla is first, for example, but it has a shitload of generations, and the Beetle remained the same car as it was initially designed. That's why I think that the Beetle is the most recognized, the most cool vehicle, and of course that vehicle has one of the most interesting fates amongst the other models of any car concerns. And as such, we could say that yes, the history of the concern began with theft and lies, with Czechoslovakia and Germany, people of Germany that had given their money for cars they didn't even see later. And most of them perhaps didn't even live up to the moment when the Volkswagen Beetle came out because of the war. Plus, Germany was divided in two, the western and the eastern one. And by the way, Volkswagen paid compensations only to Western company. Eastern Germany didn't get it at all. And Porsche, who created his vehicle, didn't show his best behavior. But nevertheless, as a result, we have now the largest and the most successful car concern on our planet. And I'm really certain and think that Volkswagen produces the best vehicles right now. That is, if we talk about the whole Volkswagen Group. And that is its history. I wanted to share it with you now. It's really important. What do you think about it? Should we make such videos? Was it interesting? Did you know about it or not? Because I've known about that situation from the beginning. Back in my day, I liked to dig into history and to watch documentaries. I was interested in the way cars were being made and how they turned to be those that we see now. And I dare say that the Volkswagen Beetle is one of the icons. One of those cars, in principle, well, we owe all of those cars we have right now to them exactly. Because it's one of the first people's vehicles. What about the Ford Model T that is believed to be the first and the most real people's vehicle? I can't tell for certain that the Beetle is the real people's car or the Ford Model T, but at least the Beetle was intended to be a social project, in spite of that gruesomeness and all special for dumb bases. I tell you that I don't share the views of Nazi Germany, and if I like Volkswagen, not like that. I'm not telling you about that right now. No, I like cars that exist now, but their history, well, it's like it is, that's all. There is nothing to do. The Beetle was still intended to be a social project, to be a car that should be a people's vehicle, and the Ford Model T was business. And yes, car concerns are just business now. Actually, social projects, well, cars as social projects, there were many of them. And the car history is really freaking many-sided. That's why, if you like this format, be sure to show it to your friends, leave likes, write comments below. Let's make this video to be on some real trend. If that happens, we'd know that we could really work this format. Actually, I have at least 5-6 interesting ideas for this format. Thank you for watching this video. We spent much energy on it, really. So, thank you for watching it till the end. See you in the next video. Bye. Well, like, bye. Well, f***. Could I go to jail for that? No. No? Okay. Stas is trying to share the video with the text written by himself for the first time. Because we'll have a long and through but interesting conversation. That's good? That's from my head, not from script. I know this paragraph and what I need to say, that's all, fuck you. And on this script there is, if I could intrigue you, you should leave a like to this video right now, get yourselves comfortable, and first things first. Yeah, bitch. He deserved his credit for putting into assembly line that sophisticated production that needed to be maintained throughout its useful life, the vehicle. How could I say that shit right now? I'm valuable because I speak human language, but I write with fucking technological language. I'm an engineer, that's why. Fuck. The Secret of the Sage of Zion, motherfucker. It's written by Russians. And naturally, because Hitler shipped, well, he shipped, so that the car could contain 2 grown-ups and 3 fingers problem. In the 30s, he even visited the Soviet, the plane, aircraft, fucking planes, the Soviet aircraft factories, fuck. KDF stands for Kraut der Freude. I guess if I speak German right, and it translates as power through joy. Kraft durch Freude. Freude. I don't speak German at all, fuck off, guys. In promotional videos and propaganda, Gendi, and the guys had a whole fleet of those ships, and how the fuck Wilhelm Gustloff. And the guys had a whole fleet of those ships, and the main liner was called the William... Make it off screen. And the guys had a whole fleet of those ships, and their flagman was the William... And the guys, by the way, had a whole fleet of those ships, and their flagman was the Wilhelm Gustloff. I can't say that shit. I'd say that bucket. Would you plan it? You would know. And if you missed just one payment, all the previous ones died at once. And when a person gathered 990 marks, I mean Reichsmarks, no the fuck. Of course, they began to build the Volkswagen factory at once. And in year 1938, what happened? It was open, right?